what we have on the docket is women's history. And I'm going to a timeline women's history from the Revolutionary period, which is in period 3, all the way through the end of World War II. This is a topic that has come up many, many times over the course of the years on the AP exam. It's been full of DBQ questions. And so we want to just kind of timeline it, not only because you could have a full DBQ on women's history, but also because women's history intersects with so many other topics that could also show up. So when I do my timeline, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically use 2 pages, and I'm going to divide my timeline into fourths. So I'm going to break up women's history into 4 different periods. And I'm going to do it for 4 periods here, and I'm going to do another 4 periods on the next sheet. So 8 total. And I'm just going to kind of walk you through how women's history has changed and what has also remained the same from the Revolutionary period, which is going to be from 1776 to 1800, after America has kind of gotten its start after the Constitution. I'm going to walk you through what was happening to women in the Market Revolution. And the Market Revolution is ongoing, but we're going to just trace that to about 1820. We're going to talk about women's history in the Antebellum period, the period before the Civil War. And then finally, we're going to, and that goes to 1860. Finally, we're going to talk about, at least for this first sheet,
Sean, did you fix that?
like women during the Civil War and immediately after, during Reconstruction, which will take us, Reconstruction ends around 1877. So we'll end this, just to be nice and round, round numbers, around 1880. Okay, so that's going to be our timeline. You can create that timeline for yourself as well, and just kind of divide up your notes like that. Okay, so I'm going to start all the way at this first time period. Let me zoom in here, which is the Revolutionary period. Okay, and I'm going to begin by talking just about, what was women's role in American history early on. So, women had obviously been equal partners, and I say that in terms of work, like helping to, pioneer America, helping to helping with the founding of the colonies. And women had a lot of freedoms in the colonial period because they were working side by side with men to build, American society out of nothing, out of the wilderness. And during the American Revolution, we see women continuing to contribute in a big way to American history by actively being involved in the American Revolution. So I'm going to just write that down. I'm going to say women actively contribute to the American Revolution. And that's important to note, that women were an important part of the Revolutionary period. Obviously, we hear more about figures like George Washington and Samuel Adams, but women were actively involved in nursing during the war. They were managing farms as a lot of their husbands went and fought. And in some cases, they served in combat as well. So we see a number of women either supporting troops or in some cases actively fighting. Probably the most famous story involving that would be figures like Molly Pitcher, who brought water to soldiers on the battlefield and even fought. Okay, so there were important figures in the Revolutionary era, and women were contributing to the American Revolution, certainly just as men. Now, it's during this time period that we're going to see a number of women that are championing for changes in women's rights. Women had historically been viewed as staying out of politics. Women were not supposed to be involved in political discussions because it was considered to be unladylike. And what we start to see is figures like Abigail Adams, who is the wife of John Adams, arguing that women should be included in the new government. So I'm going to put Abigail Adams, champion women's rights. So Abigail Adams is going to make an argument. She writes a letter to her husband, John Adams, to remember the women. Now, unfortunately, women were not given the rights to vote. Women were not politically treated as equals to men after the Revolutionary period. But we do see an important concept emerging during this time period called Republican motherhood. And while this doesn't give women equal rights, it does argue that women have an important role in society as America moves forward. So Republican motherhood makes the argument that women need to not only be the protectors of morality in society, but women need to be educated themselves so that they can educate their children, teach them to read, to teach them to write, teach them like virtues like honesty and hard work so that they can participate in our new democratic society. And so out of Republican motherhood, women become more political, even though they're not directly voting and they're not directly participating. But also there's kind of this established norm that's going to continue throughout all of American history that women are the protectors of morality. And you're going to see this over and over again as women being heavily involved in the moral development of the United States. Okay, so that's the Revolutionary period. And that takes us to our next period, which is the Market Revolution. Now, the Market Revolution is that period where the United States begins the earliest parts of industrialization. And women are important in this change that's happening in the early 1800s. So it is almost immediately during the Market Revolution that women are going to help stimulate it because women are going to leave farms and enter into the workforce. So women are an important part of the earliest forms of industrialization that are happening in the United States. There we go. It's a little bit better. Let me zoom in here. There we go. It's much better. Okay. And we see this. Women are going to help pioneer industrialization. So it can be argued that some of the earliest industries in the United States wouldn't have happened without women serving as an important part of the labor force. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. Just write this down. So women helped pioneer early industrialization. Now, probably the best example of what I'm talking about during this time period is the Lowell girls, which happens in the Lowell mills. So if you remember right, going all the way back to 1811 when the Lowell mills were established, one of the things that they did was they created dormitories for their workers, and they hired primarily young women to work in these factories making the textile products, and that's basically what got these mills off the ground. That's what they served as a workforce for the earliest forms of industrialization. And of course, women were they were housed in these dormitories. They were expected to maintain a certain level of morality, and that was obviously embedded in them coming to work. But it kind of demonstrates the important role that women are playing early on as we see a economic change. Now, out of this time period, there's a certain number of people who are worried that more and more women could leave the home and go into the workforce, and then what that would mean for morality, what that would mean for our society as a whole. And so in reaction to the Market Revolution, a super important concept emerges, and that is the birth of the cult of domesticity. Underline that. Now, the cult of domesticity emerges almost in response to women going and leaving homes and taking jobs. The cult of domesticity says that there are separate spheres for men and for women, that men should be the ones that are leaving the home, taking jobs, whereas women should remain in the home where they can raise children and they can like look after the morality of the family, promote morality within the family. So the cult of domesticity, which emerges in response to women taking jobs in the market revolution, is going to be a persistent idea that is going to carry throughout this entire time period, even into today. There is certain stereotypes that still exist today that women belong in the home, and that's something that has been fought against not only in like the 1800s, but even in second wave feminism, which has occurred more recently. All right, so let's go into the antebellum period from 1820 to 1860. In the antebellum period, we see women taking on a huge new roles within society. And women are responsible for a lot of the changes that are occurring in America during this time period. So I'm going to zoom out here so I have more room. The first thing I want us to all note is that it's during this time period, it's really at the beginning, that the Second Great Awakening is happening. Now that's important because the Second Great Awakening is a, two C's. The Second Great Awakening, which is occurring during this time period, is a religious revival, and it emphasizes the need for greater morality within society. And so women are heavily involved in the Second Great Awakening. And being involved in that spiritual movement is also going to lead them to more political activism as well. So this is super important because in this time period between 1820 and 1860, one of the distinguishing characteristics of this era leading up to the Civil War is that there's this birth of all these reform movements in the 1830s and the 1840s that are going to have a huge impact on the way that people are thinking. Women are some of the pioneers of those reform movements. So let's write down right now that women become very active in new reform movements. So women become more active in new reform movements. Now, and there are a lot of examples of this. So I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to go through some examples of reform movements that were pioneered by women. So one of the more important reform movements during this time period that was definitely helped pioneered by women is the temperance movement. Now, I'd like to point out, remember, that women had been considered the guardians of morality in society. And so there were growing fears during this time period that alcohol abuse, drunkenness was leading to a loss of values in the United States. And so the temperance movement kind of emerges in order to try to fix this, and women were heavily active in that. You've also got women like Dorothea Dix, promoting the asylum movement and working for to help improve the lives of people that are blind and deaf. And we see also the emergence of the penitentiary movement in order to try to reform criminals. That's coming about during this time period. One of the most important movements that's happening that is associated with women is abolitionism. All right, so the abolitionist movement comes out of the Second Great Awakening, or at least it changes because of the Second Great Awakening. And the abolitionist movement starts to see slavery as a sin. Well, women are heavily involved in that transition. And so we see people like, for example, the Grimke sisters, who want to be more active in abolition. We see later on, like in the 1850s, Harriet Beecher Stowe writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. And also in the 1850s, we see Harriet Tubman, who is a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So women are actively involved in this movement to eliminate and free slaves. Okay, now they also faced resistance, and this is super important to understand. There were women who were forbidden to participate in some of these political meetings just because of their gender. And so it's during this time period that women realize that they need a movement of their own, a movement just for women's rights. And so it's during this time period that we see the birth of first wave feminism. It's the birth of the feminist movement. And we see that with, in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. It's 1848. And that was led by activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and other early feminists are going to, they're going to help create something called the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, which is modeled after the Declaration of Independence. And they begin their own movement to fight for greater equality, and specifically political equality. One of the biggest goals of the feminist movement that emerges during this time period is the fight for suffrage, or the right to vote. Okay, so that takes us to our next period, which is the Civil War and Reconstruction. Okay, so what is happening with women in the period 1860 to 1880? Women are highly involved, especially now that there is an organized movement for greater rights in the form after the Seneca Falls Convention. And so women are going to be engaged during the Civil War. First of all, we have to understand that women did serve in the Civil War, not necessarily in fighting positions, but as, once again, support for the soldiers that work. So I'm going to put women serve in, did I say World War I? I'm sorry. I meant the Civil War. I'm getting ahead of myself. The women serve in the Civil War. So this is the era of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Sorry if I misspoke earlier. Women serve in the Civil War. A great example of that is like figures like Clara Barton. And Clara Barton is going to essentially help pioneer better sanitation on the battlefield. She is going to work to make health conditions better. And eventually her work is going to lead to the development of the Red Cross. Okay, so that's obviously an important role that women are playing. It's also during this time period that we see the continued campaign for the expansion of voting rights for women. So campaign for the expansion of voting rights. And I'd like to point out that during the Civil War, it wasn't just a campaign for women. Women found allied with African Americans to expand who had right to our democratic system. And you had figures like Susan B. Anthony. And Susan B. Anthony was originally allied with Frederick Douglass and pushed for the passage of the 15th Amendment, or what would eventually become the 15th Amendment. However, in the era after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, there is a split between Susan B. Anthony and feminists with African Americans over the fact that the 15th Amendment did not include women. So a lot of feminists were very, very disappointed that when the language for the 15th Amendment was finally worked out, it did not include voting for women. So I'm going to put split with civil rights leaders over the 15th Amendment. Okay, now that being said, even though women aren't given the right to vote by the federal government, women out west are experiencing more rights. Because out west, which is still the frontier during this time period, it's less settled, women begin to be granted more rights. And so put women in the West gain more rights, and specifically voting rights. So it is out West that women are first allowed to vote. And Wyoming becomes the first state to grant women the right to vote, and they do so in 1869. So Wyoming grants women the right to vote in 1869. Okay, so we've got an organized, at this point, let me just zoom out here. Let's see. So in this first part, we've got obviously women are being denied political rights, but they are continuously viewed as moral leaders within society. But despite the fact they're being denied political rights, women are becoming more and more political, okay? And they're starting to gain more and more momentum towards the right to vote, and also to be involved in other political causes that they truly believe in, whether it's the temperance movement, abolitionism, like the asylum movement, or something else like that, okay? Now, we're gonna move this to the second half. So I'm gonna just start over with a new page, okay? And just like in the first timeline, I'm gonna draw a line across the page, and I'm gonna divide it into fourths. So there's my 4. And the eras that we're gonna look at on this, so we're still doing women's history. So the eras we're going to look at in the second half is we're going to talk about from 1880 to around 1900. We're going to talk about women in the Gilded Age. From 1900 to 1920. So we're going to talk about women during the Progressive Era and World War I. From 1920 to 1941, which is going to be the Roaring 20s and the Great Depression. And then I'm going to finish it off by talking about women in World War II. And that takes us through the periods that we need to know for our test, okay? So this is where I'm going to kind of finish up with, okay? So let's get right into it. Let's talk about women in the Gilded Age, okay? So during the Gilded Age, from 1880 to 1900, let me zoom in here. Okay, there we go. From 1880 to 1900, we see the rise of the social gospel movement. And the social gospel movement was about applying Christian values to like what we see, the cities, the growing cities that are happening during the Gilded Age. So if you remember the Gilded Age, there's a rise of cities, there's new immigrants that are coming in, we're converting from a rural society to an industrial society. So in keeping with the social gospel movement and the fact that women are still considered to be the moral leaders of American society, women begin to pioneer new reform movements, similar to period 4. So women pioneer new reform movements. So what are some examples of this? Okay, one good example is we see the growth of, or the creation of, the settlement house movement, which, you know, probably the most famous person who's involved in that is Jane Addams. So the settlement house movement, and associated with that is Jane Addams. 2 Ds. Now, settlement house movement reflects the social gospel because it's about providing for those that are less fortunate, and Jane Addams' Hull House essentially tried to provide people in poverty as well as immigrants with education, with a place to stay, in order to provide, to support them, in order to, and then eventually allow them to get back on their own feet. It's considered to be like some of the earliest examples of social work in American society. Now, another example of like growing movements during this time period would be people like Florence Kelley. And Florence Kelley was a strong advocate against child labor laws, or for child labor laws, not against them. She opposed child labor, which was a major issue that was happening during the Gilded Age, and she wanted to see the practice end completely. Oh, sorry. Let's go there. No, that's not what I want to do. Sorry. That's better. There we go. Okay, so other groups that would fit into this time period for the Gilded Age's reforms. There's a reemergence of the temperance movement. And we can see that with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The temperance movement, now that slavery has been abolished, kind of becomes one of the more popular movements in the late 1800s. And we even see advocates like Mary Lease, who is a big supporter of temperance out west. She also becomes an advocate for the populist movement, which women are going to be a part of. Okay, continuing on. We also see during this time period, in addition to like these new reform movements, we also see like new women's organizations like be created for the sole purposes of continuing to fight for greater suffrage and greater rights for women. So it's during this time period that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are going to help found NASA, which becomes one of the more important women's rights groups, and they're going to push for women's suffrage. So NASA, to push for women's suffrage. And lastly, and this is something that we also want to note during this time period, not only do we have obviously greater women's rights reform movements, we've got new women's rights organizations, we also have to remember that women are taking a larger economic role in the in American society. So as America industrializes, we see a lot of women enter into the workforce in order to help support their family. And like we see increasingly, especially in like poor areas of the United States, both members of the family, both men and women, having to work in order to help pay for rent and to be able to put food on the table. So during this time period, women are entering the workforce in larger numbers, but they are facing lower pay and a lot of like economic discrimination. I'm going to put face lower wages. So many times women were barred from joining unions. Like the Knights of Labor were open to them, but other groups were not. Their pay was less by just virtue of their gender. And so as a result, women were not given as many opportunities economically as men during this time period. Okay, so that takes us to our next period, which is the Progressive Era. So what's happening in the Progressive Era for women? There's some really important developments that I want to go through. So the first thing we have to know is that women are actively involved in the Progressive Era. So for those that don't remember what the Progressive Era is, the Progressive Era was basically the response to the Gilded Age. Progressive Era. Women are actively involved in Progressive Era. Now, so what's happening is there's this movement to try to get government to fix some of the problems that happened during that era of industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. And women are leaders within this movement. So you've got, for example, muckrakers like Ida Tarbell, who's talking about the growth of monopolies. You've got civil rights advocates like Ida B. Wells, who is writing about lynchings that are happening in the New South. And once again, Jane Addams is going to continue to be active in this time period for greater sanitation, for like cities and better conditions. She's going to be opposed to child labor. She's heavily active as a part of her work with Hull House. Okay, so I'm going to keep zooming in here. So women are going to be actively involved in the progressive movement, and we can see some examples of that, both as muckrakers and as activists. It's also during this time period that we see women entering the workforce in larger numbers, especially as a result of World War I. So during World War I, women play an important role on the home front. So women are taking jobs in factories, helping produce the things that are necessary to support soldiers that are overseas. And we see that leading to higher numbers of women in the workforce, okay? We also see new civil rights organizations, more radical feminist organizations emerge. So I'm gonna put more radical feminist organizations emerge. Now, what do I mean by that? During this time period, you got NASA that's still around, but it's during this time period that we start to see leaders like Alice Paul and her organization known as the National Women's Party start to take more extreme actions to get women the right to vote. So they start demanding like the right to suffrage immediately. During World War I, the National Women's Party and Alice Paul directly picket the White House, and they picket Woodrow Wilson in order to gain attention for their cause. And so they're taking more extreme measures to have women's voices heard. And this is obviously going to be an important step that will, by the end of World War I, lead us to the 19th Amendment, which we'll get to in a second. Before we get to the 19th Amendment, there's two other things I want to recognize that are happening in this time period that are super important. Number one, we've got a figure like Margaret Sanger, who is going to open her first birth control clinic. And she does that actually just right before World War I in 1916. World War I's going on, but the United States isn't involved. So Margaret Sanger is important because she's kind of advocating for an issue that women also were facing like discrimination on, and that was more access or control over their own body, access to birth control information, or in some cases, just birth control in general, contraception and so on. And so Margaret Sanger opens this first birth control clinic in 1916, and her work is going to continue obviously into the roaring 20s and later. We'll talk about that in a second. We also have some pioneers in politics. So Jeannette Rankin is going to be elected as one of the first female members of the House of Representatives. And she's elected out from a Western state. I might have been, is it Wyoming? I can't remember off the top of my head, but she's elected from a Western state where women have the right to vote. But unfortunately, women still don't have the right to vote in the East and in places across the country. So we got a female representative in Jeannette Rankin. So but Jeannette Rankin becomes first woman elected to House of Representatives. House of Representatives, and that happens in 1916 or 1917 rather. But women still don't have the right to vote across the country. That is until the end of World War I. And at the end of World War I, the 19th Amendment is passed. And the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote, which is passed in 1920. So that kind of ends our era. Okay, so during the Progressive Era, obviously women's rights are dramatically expanding, especially with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Now, two last periods that I want to talk about. The first one I'm talking about is the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression. So women have gotten the right to vote at this point, but there is a lot of inequalities. Oh, thank you. Someone looked it up. Jeanette Rankin was elected from Montana. Thank you so much for that. So women in the 1920s are going to continue to advocate for more rights. And we start to see women kind of push the boundaries, especially in the environment of the 20s in a cultural way. Okay, so like during this time period, I'm going to zoom in here. During this time period, Margaret Sanger is going to continue her work with like pushing for birth control rights. And we're going to see that become a greater issue as we move into the 1920s. So Margaret Sanger continues to push for birth control rights. And it's important to understand that it was illegal to circulate information about like birth control and contraception at this time period due to a series of laws that were on the books. So what she was doing was essentially advocating for something that was illegal. So it was a big deal, and we do kind of have to acknowledge that. The other thing is that during this time period, we start to see women start to push against some of the more conservative traditional roles that women had previously had in society. So in the 1920s, for example, we see the emergence of the flapper. And the flapper is important because the flapper challenges these old stereotypes of what women were supposed to be. So, you know, women were supposed to be the moral compasses in society. Women were supposed to stay in the home. And here you have young women who are, they're going out, they're listening to jazz music, they're dancing, they're smoking, and they're pushing the boundaries of culture at the time period, as well as the morality of traditional morality in America at the time period. Now, flappers there was still a lot of pressure on flappers, and many flappers ended up, after they were young, settling down, marrying, and eventually kind of falling into the cult of domesticity, which there was a lot of pressure to do. But it is a challenge during this time period that's going to be important for women's rights. Now, we also see like other women pioneers during this time period. Amelia Earhart is going to be the first woman to fly solo nonstop across the Atlantic. First woman to fly solo nonstop across the Atlantic. Now, the first person to do this was Charles Lindbergh, which was a really big deal. The second person to do this is Amelia Earhart, kind of like shattering these ideas about what women could or could not do in society. And so, you know, she becomes an important pioneer for women, especially in aviation, but in other fields as well. And then we've got other figures who are helping to kind of expand the role of women in society. A good example of that is Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt is the first lady to FDR during his New Deal. And she becomes an important political voice in the New Deal. Probably should capitalize that. New Deal. And she definitely has influence over the policies of the New Deal in the 1930s. So women um, are are political, and they're remaining political. Even as they get the right to vote, we see women have kind of continue to push to have more power within America, to kind of challenge cultural stereotypes that existed during this time period, and also as we get into the period of World War II, to economically have more rights as well. So it takes us to our last era, which is the era of World War II. And I just want to kind of finish up by talking about during World War II, how women are going to enter into the workforce in large numbers. And that's maybe one of the most important things to know about World War II in regards to women's history. So women enter into the workforce in larger numbers, so much so that they're big part of the reason why the United States wins World War II is because of factory production, which could not have been done without all the women that are entering into the workforce. And that kind of is like the stereotypical like image of Rosie the Riveter. Actually, it's not so much a stereotype, but the image of Rosie the Riveter is all about like women in the workforce that are helping produce the bombs, the planes, the tanks that are going to help the United States win the war. Now, it is women's increased role, especially in the workplace, that are going to create new calls for a women's movement after the war. So I'm going to put new calls for women's rights after World War II. So it's important to understand that women had gotten the right to vote, but there was obviously still economic disadvantages that women faced. Women oftentimes were paid less. Women were not allowed to do all the jobs that men were allowed to do. There were certain assumptions that there were men's jobs and women's jobs. Women were culturally still expected to be in the home because of the cult of domesticity. And so after World War II, we see like the image of Rosie the Riveter and the economic gains that women make during this time period kind of giving way to a new feminist movement that's going to emerge in the 1950s. That becomes known as second wave feminism, which we're going to which we have talked about, and which I will not go over here because it won't be on the test. But just be aware of like this is leading into second wave feminism, where women are going to challenge those stereotypes. They're going to challenge the cult of domesticity. They're going to like break through the glass ceiling and open up new professions to women that hadn't historically been allowed before. And so we kind of see this like continuation of progress that's going to happen into the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and today. Okay, so this is women's history, and obviously it's not complete. It's a brief outline, but it covers a lot of the big ideas that you need to be aware of for the AP test.